Morning, and appreciate hearing from our colleague on the House side, Chairman Walden, in that beautiful radio baritone voice that he has. I'm sure that when I was growing up in South Dakota, the little town I grew up in, the western part of the state, we got one TV station, and of course all we got basically was AM radio, which we picked up out of Bismarck, North Dakota, or Rapid City, South Dakota. But our one TV station, of course, carried the NFL games on Sunday. And I'm a lifelong Green Bay Packer fan. Any other Packer fans here? Okay, a few. Good, thank you. But most of the people in my state are Viking fans, and so there you go. And so the game that was carried every week on Sunday was the Vikings game. And the only time I got to see the Green Bay Packers were the 2 times a year they played the Minnesota Vikings in the black and blue division, the Central Division. But it just reminds me of how far we've come. And just the ubiquitous access that we have to so many different opportunities in video and audio and broadband and high-speed services. And I look at my dad, who is will be 99 years old in December, and up until a couple of months ago was living in the little house I grew up in my hometown, and is now spending time with my sister down in Nebraska. But literally can go online. He follows on Twitter. He's on email. He's got all the access to all these things at his stage in life. And it's just really pretty remarkable in a short amount of time. But I think that'll pale in comparison to where we can go if we make the right decisions going forward. And I, too, want to thank Shahira and thank the President and the team here at the White House for their leadership on this and their willingness to convene this today. And to also say to all of you in the private sector and our colleagues in the Congress and at the regulatory agencies, and great to see members of the FCC here today, that this kind of partnership, I think, is what it's going to take for America to win the race to 5G. My colleague in the Senate and on the committee and partner, Senator Wicker, and I and our colleagues on the Senate Commerce Committee have been very active and very busy, I think, as you know, on these issues, and will continue to plow forward. Sometimes it's challenging in the Senate, and Chairman Walden pointed out that they send things to the Senate and they seem to slow down over there. I think the founders designed it that way, but there are a number of things that we are working on with bipartisan support that I hope will lead to some really good outcomes and results for the future of our country. But the race has begun, and if we're going to lead it and get to gigabit speeds and low latency and connection to a tremendous number of devices, we have to take the right steps and put the right policies in place in order to make that happen. But it is a race that we need to win. And by many accounts, we're already behind China and other nations in key areas. But here's what's at stake. 5G is expected to contribute $275 billion in new investment in our economy, expected to create $500 billion in economic growth and 3 million new jobs. Now, make no mistake, we have the technology. The technology is created by American industries, including those that are represented here today. And it's the best around, and it leads the world in next-generation mobile communications. But that technology is only part of the equation. We've also got to ensure that wireless providers have the infrastructure on which their systems depend, and they must be able to deploy those networks in a reasonable and timely manner. It was mentioned earlier, Shahira mentioned, but Senator Schatz and I have a bipartisan bill in the Senate called the Streamlined Small Cell Deployment Act, which does reflect the hard work of stakeholders from across the country, and it's designed to eliminate the needless barriers to deploying 5G and to bring the benefits of 5G to American consumers. The Streamlined Act will help America reap the benefits of 5G leadership. At the same time, it respects the important role that state and local governments play in deployment decisions. And I have to say to our colleagues at the FCC that I am very pleased that the FCC has just taken an important step to modernize its regulations consistent with the goals that are in the Streamline Act. The final piece of the puzzle that has been mentioned is spectrum. Spectrum is the lifeblood of wireless communications, and it presents a particular challenge for 5G. The bipartisan bicameral communications bill that my colleagues and I passed earlier this year and that the President signed into law is a good start. As part of that package, the Mobile Now Act, which I authored along with some of our colleagues in the Senate, requires that 255 megahertz of spectrum be identified for fixed and mobile wireless broadband use by 2022. But if America's wireless carriers do not have enough of the right kinds of spectrum available, Americans simply won't have the speed and the connections that we need. And you heard Chairman Walden allude to that earlier. But it's particularly important and relevant to those of us in rural America where the business case for deployment is very different than it is in America's big cities. And while we've made important progress in securing low and high band spectrum, the United States is falling behind when it comes to mid-band spectrum. And that's particularly troubling because mid-band spectrum is crucial to the initial deployment of 5G. Only 150 megahertz of mid-band spectrum has been specifically identified for likely 5G use, and that is on a shared basis under a fairly creative and novel licensing scheme. This puts us behind both China and South Korea in 5G spectrum and represents a serious threat to American leadership of next-generation technology. We must also be mindful of the critical role that unlicensed spectrum plays in the development of 5G and throughout the communications landscape. Wi-Fi operating on unlicensed spectrum is responsible for a tremendous and growing amount of the data that's transmitted in our homes and offices and will play an increasing role in the future. Identifying spectrum resources not just for the next few years, but for the next 10 years and beyond is essential if we're going to retain American leadership. And so I look forward to working with the administration, with my colleagues in the House and the Senate, as we continue our efforts to keep government out of the way so that America can continue its leadership in next-generation technology. And we thank you all for the important role that you're playing in that process, and hope that this is a very productive meeting today, and we'll look forward to talking about these issues for some time to come. Thank you.